all of us likely spend part or maybe even all of our time wrestling with these issues, trying to protect youth and adults from various forms of victimization, which might of course include hate speech and hate crimes. And this is a noble calling. This is a noble way to spend our professional lives. And the issues are very complex, as Dorothy mentioned, but we need to continue to co-labor together. And just know that everyone on this panel, as well as if it's okay for me to speak for other people, we are willing to assist you in any way that we can, because we think about youth and adults who have been victimized and how they've absolutely needed someone to come through for them. So with that said, and I do want to build on what Dorothy has shared, let us begin. First thing is that we think about all these different platforms that have gained prominence and traction over the last handful of years. And I don't want to specifically demonize or vilify any of them, frankly, because the reality of hate speech and hate crimes can occur on any of these platforms. It only takes one individual to be an aggressor in these extremely vicious ways, targeting someone based on their identity, based on something that they can't control. And we'll talk a little bit later about how that translates to offline violence. The one thing that I do want to point out, though, is that the vast majority of individuals are being relatively respectful or at least neutral on these platforms. There's always going to be, though, a minority, a small proportion, which misuses the technology when it comes to cyberbullying, when it comes to hate speech, when it comes to hate crimes, etc. And so all of our efforts when it comes to prevention and response are focused on bringing those back into the fold with the rest of us so that we can enjoy the benefits of technology and social media. Just wanted to go over briefly, very briefly, some of these definitional differences. And I appreciate Dorothy laying out her conceptualization and operationalizations. Just wanted to also give you a bit of mine. First off, just think very generally about various forms of aggression that might occur online. And I'm sure popping into your head could be examples such as trolling or stalking someone, using their device or software you've installed on their device. False reporting would just be labeling someone as an aggressor or a troll or someone who has perpetrated online abuse, but they didn't really do that. Hacking passwords, ghosting someone, etc., impersonation, identity theft, those could all be forms of aggression. So moving from that, we think about cyberbullying. We have this academic definition, and as Dorothy alluded to, there is that concept of repetition and intentionality. And of course, it's using technology. It's interesting, we have the World Anti-Bullying Forum coming up next week, and there's going to be a major session devoted to questioning our current definitions and whether we need to reevaluate them and how we can move forward so that we have a standard sense of what we're talking about. And when we do so, we're better able to, of course, measure it and then respond to it. Moving forward from cyberbullying, you think about bias-based, and I won't spend a lot of time on this since Dorothy covered it in detail, but just think about these sorts of actions targeting individuals based on the group that they belong to, something related to their identity, and doing so online. And then we have online hate. So you're targeting people, again, based on some sort of motivation bias, their identity, focusing on underrepresented individuals, underrepresented, there we go, individuals or groups or populations. And so what are some of the differences here? Well, in our conceptualizations over here at the Cyberbullying Research Center, we tend to see that cyberbullying occurs most often between peers. With regard to online hate, it tends to be strangers. And I know that Lisa will be sharing a little bit more about this, and perhaps her research has diverged from that, but this is just what we're finding, at least in our studies. Element of repetition is still key because online hate might just be one instance, but again, you don't know if it's gone viral or if other people are ganging up on a specific individual based on one comment, etc. What is the motivation? Does online hate speech online relate to the fact that people are angry, the fact that people fear something? Maybe it's just related to ignorance. Maybe they feel that their livelihood is being threatened, and so they must target specific populations. Maybe they feel that their way of life is going to be compromised because of this person or that person and the racial or other demographic group that they belong to. And then typically with online hate speech, we tend to see this element of extremism and radicalization, typically with political undergirdings. Advance our slides. There we go. So I have freshly squeezed data for you. In May and early June of this year, we collected national data from a pretty large sample of youth across our nation. And so you can see when it comes to cyberbullying, about 1 out of 4, if you look on the far right of the chart, say that they've been victimized, and only about 5% indicated that they were cyberbullies. So I don't love that word, but just go with me for a second. Over the last 30 days. Again, this is the last 30 days. So just use that as a backdrop as I move forward here. Then we wanted to ask them, okay, you've been bullied at school. Well, what were you bullied because of? And so this, of course, is perception based. And you can see that a solid 60% of youth who were bullied at school said that they believe it was because of their physical appearance. But related to our conversation today, I want to point out all of the identity-based victimizations specific to school bullying that we see here. Race and ethnicity, almost 1 out of 5. And then when it comes to gender, sexual orientation, disability, it's, let's say 1 out of 8, 1 out of 9, 1 out of 10. These numbers are pretty similar when you're thinking about cyberbullying, except I would say that they're slightly higher. About 1 out of 5 say that they were cyberbullied based or because of their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, etc. So it's probably in line with what you might intuit. And then I wanted to also try to break things down by race. And my colleague Justin Patchen from the University of Wisconsin, of course, we do all our work together, and he assisted with this. You can see that those who are multiracial, 29% of those who are multiracial had been recently bullied online in the last month. And you can see the percentages for the other racial groups here. Gender, we definitely have a significantly different, a statistically significant relationship here, or difference here, I apologize, where, solid 1 out of 3 of those who indicated that they were not binary, female or male, were targeted online. So clearly this is a population that disproportionately is victimized. And of course, worthy of our continued attention and support. Sexual orientation, those who are not heterosexual, again, this is a statistically significant difference here. You see 32% of those who are not heterosexual were targeted as compared to 21% of those who are heterosexual. Again, this is cyberbullying over the last month, being victimized. So on a previous study that we conducted back in 2019, we looked at religion. And first off, you see here that starting from the far left, around 1 out of 3 of those who are Muslim say they were cyberbullied. Of those who are Catholic, it's about 21%. And you can see the breakdown related to some of these other populations: Hindu, Jewish, etc. What I think might be more interesting is, we asked individuals, okay, we understand that you belong to this specific religious group. How many of you believe that you've been targeted specifically because of your religion? You can see here that, for example, 26.3% of those who are Muslim felt specifically that they were targeted because they were Muslim. You can see again the percentages for the other religious groups. Again, just sort of providing us with reference points as we move forward. And then thinking about prevention and response, and we'll talk more about that in just a couple of minutes. We've recently been looking at empathy, and Justin and I are working on a paper, and you all understand the difference between cognitive and affective empathy, whereas cognitive empathy relates to one's ability to recognize and understand another person's emotions and experiences, whereas when it comes to affective empathy, it's, can you share the same feelings of the other person? And what we're seeing in this specific slide, at least, is that those with high levels of cognitive empathy and those with high levels of affective empathy, they're much less likely to target other individuals online in terms of cyberbullying with regard to race. So race-based cyberbullying offended. Again, those who had higher levels of cognitive and affective empathy did that to a much lower degree. And it was the same sort of findings when we looked at religious-based cyberbullying. So empathy matters clearly. Perhaps we can talk about that more when we have some discussion. I want to bring to your attention the reality that BJS collects regularly via the NCVS information related to hate crimes. And this, of course, informs our view about the prevalence of this specific phenomenon. However, when it comes to being categorized as a hate crime, one of 3 specific elements must be present. And if you look at the top of this chart, that sort of dark blue color, I'm colorblind, so I'm pretty sure that's dark blue. First off, according to the victim report, the police have to confirm that it was a hate crime based on their interpretation, or according to the victim's perceptions or perspective, the offender left some sort of hate signs or symbols at the scene, or again, according to the victim's perspective, the offender used certain hate language. And so if one of those is present, then we have a hate crime. What are some contributing factors? And this is just, I think, important for us to think through as we move forward, because the goal, of course, is to identify actionable strategies. You understand that we spend time on social media, and very easily we can get caught up in some sort of, let's say, rabbit hole. My friend Justin was just telling me yesterday that he recently favorited a card trick video on one of his favorite apps. And just by doing that, just by spending a minute or two watching that video, it quickly, the algorithmic engines quickly recommended to him more and more magic trick videos. And that, of course, is really positive, because now he's learning these tricks and he's sharing them with his loved ones, and he's blowing the minds of his nieces and nephews. So that's a positive use. But we also think about, okay, we've got these individuals who hold extreme perspectives, maybe related to certain racial groups or religious groups, etc. Pretty fragmented, except for the fact of social media providing these sort of collective online identities where they can get together, where they can be like-minded, and no one's going to counter their perspectives. Instead, they're going to be reinforced, they're going to be celebrated. And so when we see this happening, there's the chance for, let's say, extreme mentalities to proliferate. We also think about how in these specific environments, whether it's a chat channel or a private group on a social media page, it's very easy for targets to be portrayed in a certain light, and for that specific perspective to become dominant, to be the way that we view this specific population. It just becomes internalized and unfortunately affects attitudes and problematic behaviors towards that population. We also know that extremists have taken advantage of the fact that there are constitutional protections related to free speech. Of course, none of that legitimizes hate speech or hate crimes, but because law enforcement has been a little bit slow in our country as well as in other countries to deal with this specific issue, particularly because of all the complexities, people do point to the fact that my expressions are protected. We are seeing, unfortunately, in some research, this trivialization related to hate speech. Maybe youth believe that it's just joking, it's sarcasm, just saying certain things that they might overhear or have picked up from somewhere. But obviously, none of this should be rationalized or justified, because then it gives other people a reason to do it as well. We are also seeing, unfortunately, that some youth are believing that this is just part and parcel of growing up these days. And with that mentality, they would hesitate to report, because they might think other people might have reported this, nothing's really being done. I'm seeing this not everywhere, but many places. And so for that reason, there's no point in addressing it or fighting it. We also see, and you've probably experienced this as well on social media, that sometimes images that are racist in nature, or memes, or specific tropes, they go viral, they get some traction, and it's extremely unfortunate. And people, again, might justify it and say, oh, it's just humor, and certain policies on social media sites might even allow for it to some degree, on its face at least, before it's actually moderated by a manual reviewer. But still, that allows some of that to be out there. And then finally, legislation, obviously doing our parts, but how much of a deterrent power does legislation have? And then law enforcement, of course, is working so hard to catch up and to make progress in this area. I think it's important to always remember when we're thinking about hate crime that we shouldn't focus specifically and only on that event. We have to understand that it started from somewhere. It started with, again, attitudes that are favorable towards an extremist mentality or to a hateful mentality towards certain populations. And then it led to speech, and that speech was perhaps tolerated, condoned, and then maybe it led to certain conflicts, and then eventually it could lead to hate crimes. And so viewing it along a continuum and viewing it as a process, I think, is much more helpful when we're thinking about specific points to target in that process in order to deal with the problem. When it comes to hate criminals, or those who perpetrate these specific offenses, it doesn't just happen where you're online and you have some sort of conflict, and then you go off on that other person, and then you go off on similar people offline. No, I mean, there's definitely ecological factors and social and structural factors that do matter. For example, the population that you live in related to racial demographics, um, the employment rate in that specific population, that all matters. Additionally, who do you hang out with? We think about birds of a feather, and obviously, if you're sharing time online and offline with individuals who adhere to a certain mentality, a biased mentality, a hateful mentality towards certain groups, then slowly but surely seeds will be planted and you'll adopt a similar mentality. And then differential reinforcement just relates to, are certain attitudes and actions, let's say words or posts online, being celebrated, being or leading to, let's say, status in certain online groups or channels that you frequent. And if so, well, the behavior is going to continue. So when you think about individuals who have been targeted offline, let's say at school or in the community, of course, they live with fear. They live perhaps under some level of intimidation and feelings of unsafety. And unfortunately, when you think about social media, some of these platforms, it feels like it's extending this climate of unsafety. And I feel like that's a good way to conceptualize it. Remember, there's no causal link related to online speech and then offline violence. However, the research base is incipient and emergent, continues to grow. We have been seeing that, first off, events of significance, such as terror attacks or political votes, court cases, et cetera, are leading to this groundswell eruption of various forms of hate crime. We're also seeing, irrespective or notwithstanding specific events of significance, that there is a relationship, according to some researchers, with hate speech on certain platforms, targeting race and religion, and then, of course, looking at specific acts of hate towards individuals related to race and religion offline. So the empirical relationship is there, which, of course, is cause for concern. And as I wrap up here, wanted to bring up the Pareto principle, also known as the law of the vital few. Simply means that 20% of the causes lead to 80% of the consequences. Specific to our conversation today, during the Brexit vote, it was about 5% of individuals who were responsible for about 50% of anti-Muslim sentiment online. So can we identify this population that is clearly troublesome and responsible for much of the problem? Danielle Citron and Helen Norton wrote a seminal piece back in 2011 related to what can we do about these sorts of issues. And obviously we need to combat inaction, because if everyone feels that no one's doing anything about it, then it's going to be continually condoned and passively allowed. We also need to continue to encourage and ideally hold responsible social media companies to delete problematic content. And of course, we need to promote education. This has got to be happening in schools, in communities, I would say in youth serving organizations, adult serving organizations, social service agencies. There's many platforms on which these sorts of lessons can be conveyed and inculcated. And then counterspeech. Specific to counterspeech, one of my favorite scholars is Susan Benesch, and she talks that there is value. It might not be long-term, that is yet to be studied, but at least on a short-term basis, to, for example, when you see an offender, when you see someone perpetrating hate speech online, to definitely warn them of the consequences, not only to the target, emotional, psychological, physiological, but also consequences to them as an aggressor related to their digital reputation, employment situation, the fact that they could be banned from platforms, etc. Shaming is useful as well, because nobody really wants to be labeled as a bigot or misogynist or racist, even if they act in those certain ways and are able to justify it. And then, labeling is also useful towards that end as well, because maybe it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, but if we label them in a positive way, maybe that also leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy of them acting in more pro-social ways. Empathetic responses are useful, where you see someone going off on somebody else, but you try to connect with them with a civil tone, with a polite and respectful tone, and perhaps that diffuses the situation. And you might also try affiliation, where you say something like, I'm a conservative as well, but that sort of behavior is unacceptable, or whatever you do. So just creating some sort of connectedness might allow you to convey something in a softer way, which might allow them to then change their behavior. Humor works, and then images are just very powerful because they transcend language and cultural barriers. I want to say that there's no guarantee, or there's no, let's say, direct sort of relationship here where that if you and I are exposed to hate crime material, we become perpetrators. However, of those who are perpetrators, it's pretty guaranteed that they have been exposed to hate crime material. I think it's useful to study propagation networks. How do these pieces of online hate spread, go viral? How do they increase in volume, for example, retweets, etc.? How long does it last? When does it sort of come down and fade out, so to speak? And that relates to the half-life hypothesis. This is so interesting to me. Research is very clear that yes, you might have a flare-up related to hate speech, but pretty quickly you have a reduction in the volume and it dies away in time. But there are factors that can lead to the volume going down and also it fading away. Thinking about echo chambers, you understand algorithms and ranking algorithms. You know your favorite social media site and let's say the news feed or the main page you look at. Well, all of that is showing you various pieces of content that you're most likely to find relevant and that you're most likely to engage with. However, that also means that thinking about a specific person who might be prone to hate speech or that sort of mentality, they're only seeing and spending time on content that aligns with their perspectives. And in any sort of challenging perspectives are not going to be elevated enough to show up in their news feed. And then finally, bots. Bots are a huge problem. You might have heard on Twitch in just a couple of months ago, we had a major issue where individuals were enlisting bots, obviously computers and servers and scripts in order to send fake users into a channel where a person is live streaming and say all sorts of incredibly racist, homophobic, hateful sentiments. This was extremely difficult to deal with, and I won't get into the technology about what can help, but this is an issue not just on Twitch, but many other platforms as well. And I would say that those platforms are scrambling to find solutions. We'll talk more about these sorts of issues as we move forward. Just wanted to say that I appreciate your time and attention, and I look forward to the remainder of our time together.